Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our author talk. Today's author is Scott Deitche, who is an author specializing in organized crime. And today he's going to be talking about his book, Garden State Gangland, The Rise of the Mob in New Jersey. His books include Sugar City Mafia or Cigar City Mafia, A Complete History of the Tampa Underworld, as well as Garden State Gangland. He has written articles on organized crime for local and national magazines and newspapers. Scott has been featured on the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, American Heroes Channel, A&E, C-SPAN, Oxygen, as well as over 50 national and international news and radio shows. He is a member of the Mob Museums Advisory Council, and he also runs the Tampa Mafia tours. Scott lives in St. Petersburg, Florida. So welcome, Scott, and you'll be joining us here in New Jersey in a few days to continue your research. So we welcome you, and thanks for speaking to our audience today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we jump into Scott's presentation. We'll be taking your questions at the end of his presentation, but please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. If you would like a copy of the slides, you can request them directly from Scott. I will put his contact information in the chat so that you will have that. And as always, at the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. If you have time, please complete it. Again, we appreciate any and all feedback that you can give us. And if you want some more stories about different members of the mob, maybe in New Jersey or outside of New Jersey as well, you can visit his website there, tampamafia.com/mob stories. And then one last thing before we jump in, I just want to do a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can check your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device, like a headset or earbuds, you can check to make sure it's connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you have any issues, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that and that'll alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And lastly, as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, send them to us using the Q&A or the chat features, and we'll be happy to address them at the end of Scott's presentation. So that is everything that I have for you. So it is my pleasure to turn it over to Scott now.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Let me share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Coming up good?
Looks good.
Oh, hold on. I'm gonna have to. I see what's happening. There we go. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Scott Deitche. Going to be doing a presentation here, talking to you about the rise of organized crime. And it's based on a book I wrote in 2018, Garden State Gangland. I realize that as many of you know, that the kind of the common perception of the mafia in New Jersey, they kind of go hand in hand a little bit. And I realized there wasn't really an overarching book kind of documenting the history of organized crime in New Jersey. So that's what I set out to write with this. Just kind of an overarching look at how organized crime has evolved in the Garden State. So let's start to talk a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Scott Deitche. I do live in St. Petersburg, Florida. However, I was born in Perth Amboy, Florida. Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Sorry. I grew up in Woodbridge, New Jersey, in Middlesex County, in Ford's section of Woodbridge Township, and stayed there through I graduated high school. I came to college in Florida, moved back to Jersey for about a year and a half, working on the Jersey Shore in Point Pleasant Beach, and then have been in Florida since '95. So my first couple books, I really concentrated on looking at the rise of organized crime in the Tampa area. It's generally a city people don't always associate it with the mob. And as I started expanding what I wanted to do, I was looking for things that people haven't talked about or haven't really been well represented. The world doesn't need another Al Capone book. And so my last couple books have been more Northeast focused, Garden State Gangland, which we'll talk about today. And I'm actually in the process of writing a book about Jerry Katina, who I'll talk briefly about in the presentation. And that's another New Jersey-based organized crime book that I am working on, and we'll be completing about a year from now. It'll be out in late 2025. So wanted to talk a little bit about the history. And, one of the things that kind of jumpstarts what we know is kind of the modern organized crime era in the United States happens in 1920 with the advent of Prohibition. So when the 18th Amendment comes into effect, suddenly you cannot distribute, sell, manufacture, transport alcohol in the United States. Funny little aside, nowhere does it say you can't drink it, you just can't get it anywhere. So with the emergence of Prohibition in the United States, you also see the corresponding rise in trafficking of illegal liquor and alcohol, whether it's rum coming from Central America and the Caribbean, whether it's Canadian whiskey coming across the Great Lakes from Canada, or ships coming from Europe bringing all sorts of liqueurs, wines, and then, of course, you have homegrown distillery operations that occur. And New Jersey finds itself during the Prohibition era at really being at kind of a strategic location for it because of things like Raritan Bay, Barnegat Bay. You have these coves, these inlets like the Navensink River, the Shrewsbury River, these areas that, certainly at that time in the 1920s were nowhere near as developed as they are now. You had a lot more of the natural estuary there. A lot of places where under cover of night, bootleggers can hide. They can, get through the thick reeds in the estuary and unload their wares. And generally what would happen is larger ships come in, especially in the New Jersey area, would come over from Europe, and they would anchor off the coast, and they would send smaller boats out. And bootlegging activities were going on everywhere, any kind of place that had water access. And I pulled up a few newspaper headlines here from where I was born, Perth Amboy, as well as Seawarn, which is right next door. Perth Amboy is the confluence of the Raritan and the Arthur Kill River. You have Raritan Bay right there. So, a lot of opportunities if you're an enterprising bootlegger to drop off your illegal alcohol. And I wish I had a photo of him in his skiff, but my great-grandfather, Peter Mickelson, great-great-grandfather, excuse me, Peter Mickelson was one of those enterprising bootleggers out of Perth Amboy who would often hang out off the coast and shoot illegal liquor up the Raritan River. So a little bit of a family history there in that. Now, one of the interesting things about bootlegging in New Jersey, and especially during the Prohibition era, is the emergence of kind of this specialized boat, which up in the upper left, you see they still race. They're called Jersey skiffs. And these were boats that were built and specifically designed to outrun Coast Guard cutters, which were generally larger and slower. And these smaller boats would go out to the larger ships anchored offshore, load up on liquor, and then shoot them back into shore. And this was going on everywhere from, like I mentioned, like the Raritan Bay area, all the way down to Cape May and up into the Delaware River. So anywhere where there was an opportunity to bring in illegal liquor, where there's any kind of port facility, or in some cases, a large enough beach where some of these boats could, just literally drive up on the beach and unload. This was pretty common in a lot of the coastal areas of New Jersey during this time period. Now, one of the kingpins during the Prohibition era, kind of one of the leading bootleggers of the time, was this gentleman here named Abner Longy Zwillman. He was often referred to as the Al Capone of New Jersey. And Longy, named because he was pretty tall, not necessarily the most original gangster name, but Longy Zwillman grew up in Newark, New Jersey. And I would say by the late teens, he was already starting to affiliate it with members of the burgeoning underworld. Then once the Prohibition era starts, once 1920 comes around, the Volstead Act, really kind of kickstarts Longy Zwillman into that next level. And he operates his fiefdom or his criminal enterprise out of the Hotel Riviera in Newark, which is still there. I took this picture just a few years ago. The hotel is still there. Seen better days, but it still looks nice on the outside. And this was the headquarters of the Zwillman operation. Now, out of here, Zwillman controlled a variety of different crews that were engaged primarily in bootlegging. Some of them were also doing distillery operations, but he was really more of a bootlegger guy. So he was overseeing these shipments coming in primarily from Europe at that time. And one of the interesting things about Longy Zwillman that kind of sets him apart from, say, like the Al Capones or the Dutch Schultz, kind of these big mobsters around the Prohibition era, was that he was also very much an enterprising businessman. And he took a lot of the proceeds from bootlegging and he plowed them into legitimate businesses that he owned. He owned the Public Service Tobacco Company, a brewer's yeast company. He owned a lot of different parcels of real estate throughout Newark. He was heavily involved in political activities. So he kind of was starting to make that transition already of being a quasi-legitimate businessman, all the while still running this pretty vast criminal empire. And the other thing that kind of sets Longy apart is he kind of stayed away from some of the violence that often gets associated with the bootlegging era. Now, one of his chief lieutenants and a man who would become a huge part of organized crime in New Jersey, and the subject of my next book is Gerardo Catino. Gerardo Jerry Catino was also born in Newark, and he was a key member of Longy Zwillman's Prohibition era gang. And in the post-Prohibition era, as Jerry Catino's star would rise as a made member of the Genovese crime family, eventually going all the way up to the boss of the family in the 1960s. As he was rising through the 30s, 40s, 50s, he was still very close to Longy Zwillman and some of the old cohorts from the Prohibition era. So it's interesting, you see even after the Prohibition era, some of this kind of cohesiveness of these organized criminals kind of expanding their sphere of influence throughout New Jersey. A couple other people that were during the Prohibition era really important organized crime figures in New Jersey, and were tied in with Longy Zwillman, was probably the most notorious was Ritchie The Boot Boiardo, Ruggiero Boiardo. And Ritchie The Boot was actually antagonistic against Zwillman, and they were actually kind of enemies in the initial years of Prohibition, and they later came to a peaceful understanding. But Ritchie The Boot Boiardo and his son, Anthony Tony Boy Boiardo, were members of this greater Longy Zwillman kind of mob collective where you had members of the Sicilian Mafia and Italians working together with Jewish gangsters at that time. Again, really having their fingers on the pulse of what was going on in terms of Prohibition. And what the other thing that was interesting during Prohibition is as Prohibition went on, you also see kind of customer tastes evolve. So what kind of liquor were they bringing in from overseas? Were they, people were getting tired of the rot gut whiskey and the bathtub gin. They wanted higher quality stuff to come in from Europe. So they were able to satisfy the demands of their clients at that time as well. Which you read stories about other gangsters in other parts of the United States during Prohibition, and they didn't really care about that. In fact, there's a particular affliction during this time called Jake Leg, and it took its name from an illegal drink, this ginger-based drink that was made with pretty much almost pure ethanol. And what was happening is people were literally getting poisoned from it because it was really poorly made. There was no quality control. They were just pouring this stuff in bottles. They were masking the flavor with a bunch of different flavorings and additives. And people that were drinking it were actually getting poisoned, and it was affecting their central nervous system. So they would have this kind of a leg that would drag behind them. And when people would see that, they would say, oh, he has the Jake leg. And it became kind of synonymous with poisonous alcohol during the Prohibition era. So if you wanted to be really successful, you probably a good idea not to poison your customers and to make sure that they're getting the real stuff from overseas. Now, another really popular figure during the Prohibition era, and even more so now because of the success of the HBO show Boardwalk Empire, was Nucky Johnson. And Nucky Johnson was kind of a political kingpin of Atlantic City during the Prohibition era. And, you know, Atlantic City at that time was really still a pretty popular resort town. And Nucky Johnson had his fingers in a lot of politicians' pockets, and he had a lot of sway, not only just in Atlantic City, but all the way over into Philly. And in the Prohibition era, Nucky Johnson became one of the kind of the leading overlord of the bootlegging industry in Atlantic City. And because of his power, he also became kind of a mediator with mobsters. There's a famous 1928 meeting in Atlantic City where Al Capone came in with members of the Chicago outfit, as well as some other local mobsters from New Jersey, New York, and Philly. And they had these big meetings in Atlantic City, and Nucky Johnson was there to kind of help them out, oversee everything, kind of mediate disputes. It's kind of gone into lore. It's been a little bit bigger than it was, but the fact that Nucky Johnson was able to sit at the same table as someone like Al Capone, you know, really spoke to how influential he was, especially on the docks. And if you have not had the chance to see Boardwalk Empire, I'd really recommend it. I thought it was a really well done show, and a lot of it's fictionalized. It's kind of based on the life of Nucky Johnson, but really kind of gives you a sense of how important to Atlantic City was at that time. Now, in the post-Prohibition era, you also had the emergence of kind of the national syndicate of organized crime and the different mafia families. And depending on which researcher you talk to, there's anywhere between 26 and 32 mafia families that existed around the United States at the height. And coming right out of the Prohibition era in the mid-1930s, New Jersey already is starting to emerge strong as an epicenter of not only the five families from New York, the Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, Lucchese, and Colombo, but also the Bruno family out of Philadelphia and the Decavalcante family, who are, and we'll talk about them a little bit later, they're a homegrown New Jersey-based family, primarily based out of Elizabeth at this time. And you know, New Jersey really becomes a big crossroads of organized crime families. And it'll be interesting as we go through this, talking about how some of them interact and how, you know, even though Jersey was home to so many different organized crime groups, it was often looked down upon sometimes especially by the New York mobsters, who thought they were kind of you know, at the height of the kind of the high, they were on kind of their high horse and looking down on the mob guys in New Jersey. But New Jersey is one of the only states where you have 7 different families sharing territory, sharing rackets, surprisingly very little inter-family conflict, but there were a lot of intra-family conflicts, you know, factions within families that went to war occasionally, but you never saw as much conflict between the individual families. Everyone kind of respected each other's rights to their territory and their respective rackets. In terms of the areas that these groups operated in, really the kind of the epicenter was definitely the northeast to central part of Jersey. And yes, I am a believer in the concept of central Jersey. One of the kind of the Newark, Elizabeth, Patterson area really was a hot spot. That was definitely a hotbed. The other areas, kind of central Jersey, throughout down into Trenton, there was actually Philly guys that were active in Trenton. Then like the Cherry Hill area outside Philadelphia is a very strong area for organized crime figures. And then the Jersey Shore. The Jersey Shore was always big, and we'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about a Long Branch mobster who ended up becoming pretty powerful and well known. So not only did they vacation at the Jersey Shore, but they actually had a lot of operations and stuff going on the Jersey Shore as well. So I wanted to go through and talk a little bit about some of the more probably well-known or more powerful or more influential mobsters that were around in New Jersey. And this is we're getting into the 40s and the 50s era now, as kind of the mafia really start flexing their power. So they're coming out of the Prohibition era. They're using the money they made in bootlegging. They're getting involved in illegal gambling, loan sharking, very strong into unions, very strong into the Jersey waterfront, flexing their muscle in terms of political corruption and buying off politicians, getting into real estate. And New Jersey at this time is growing, especially coming out of the post-World War II era into the 50s. There's a huge surge in development, a lot of the suburbs I grew up in Fords, they were platted in the late 1950s. So, this is the time where a lot of that old farmland is starting to become subdivisions and developments. You're really starting to see, New Jersey grow in terms of the population. Angelo DeCarlo was coming out of that era, was a very powerful mobster, a member of the Genovese crime family. And Jip unfortunately became really well known because starting in the late 1950s into the early 60s, the FBI installed a series of illegal bugs in his headquarters. And the DeCarlo tapes, as they come to be known, were one of the very first times that the FBI were able to really penetrate the inner sanctum of an organized crime figure. And unfortunately for Jip, he had no idea this was going on, and this happened up in North New Jersey. Now, I've read through the transcripts. I actually have copies of the original transcripts, and there's a very large amount of very mundane talk between these mob guys. But the FBI were able to use some of the information gleaned from these tapes to kind of get a better picture of how organized crime and the mob were operating in New Jersey. This picture is a really interesting picture, and I like to talk about this. It's obviously a gory photo. This is Willie Moretti. Willie Moretti was a well-known mobster who operated in the Palisades up in like Fort Lee area of New Jersey. He had started suffering from some mental illness. Some people said it might have been advanced syphilis. And he started talking out about the mafia a little bit more openly than the mob liked. And this included talking in front of a congressional committee about organized crime in New Jersey. So he was invited to a meeting at Joe's Elbow Room up in the Palisades. And as he was eating lunch, two gunmen came in and shot and killed Willie Moretti. And, this obviously is as I mentioned, kind of a gory photo, but the thing that fascinates me are the people in the window looking in. And I think, one of the questions I get asked is, why do you think there's this fascination with organized crime or the underworld? And this picture kind of shows that these people are just like gawking in, gazing at this rubbed out mobster on the floor. I think there's this morbid fascination sometimes, and this fascination with the darker side that 99% of us are never going to go out and do this stuff. So we kind of look through that window, kind of safe enough distance away through the window so it's protected, and kind of looking into this world of organized crime and the mob. A couple other very powerful and well-known and influential mafia figures throughout the 50s, 60s, and in Tony Banana's case into the 70s even. So Tony Banana's Caponegro over on the right, he was a Newark-based mobster. But what was interesting is that he was head of a crew in Newark that reported to the Philadelphia Mafia. So the Philly family had this outpost in Newark, it was primarily in the ironbound section of Newark, that operated for decades. And Tony Bananas was the leader of this group. He was very politically connected in Newark. And he worked very seamlessly with the other organized crime families that operated in the area. And Tony Bananas, his headquarters was also in the Ironbound, and he was really kind of a very feared figure internally in organized crime, especially in the Bruno family. And in the late 1970s, as gambling became legal in Atlantic City, Tony Bananas felt that the Philadelphia Mafia should get more involved. They should have a bigger seat at the table and wanted to extort more money out of what was coming in Atlantic City in terms of the casinos. And he was not happy with his boss, Angelo Bruno. So he orchestrated the murder of Angelo Bruno, the boss of Philadelphia, in 1980. And a week after that murder, Tony Bananas was summoned to a meeting with the heads of the Genovese family in New York. And that was the last time he was seen alive. Joe Ziccarelli, Bayonne Joe, as his nickname suggests, operated out of Bayonne. He was a member of the Bonanno crime family. And of the 5 New York crime families, the Bonanno family probably had the least presence in New Jersey. But Bayonne Joe was very powerful figure at the ports. He was a very powerful political figure too. He had ties into a number of state senators in New Jersey. And in the late 1960s, his ties to the politicians were exposed in a series of news reports and exposés. And if you really want to get a sense of how ingrained organized crime had become in New Jersey, even through the political structure, Bayonne Joe's ties to state senators, mayors, it was very extensive. And he's a perfect example of how the mafia were able to leverage the money they were making into buying and currying favor with politicians, as well as people in law enforcement. And you have to remember, up on through the 1960s, the FBI really wasn't paying much attention to the mafia. They didn't really start paying attention into the 60s. And it wasn't until the early 1970s with change in some laws, that the advent of the RICO law, which now allowed them to look at the mafia as a criminal enterprise rather than just arresting individual mobsters. That's when they really started this crackdown. But before then, the mafia, especially in Jersey, were able to get their hooks very deeply into a large number of politicians, and it took quite a while to kind of extricate itself from that relationship. I don't know why that one came on sideways. I apologize. But the gentleman on the right, Tino Fiumara, was kind of I would call him a third generation Genovese crime family boss. He emerged in the 1970s out of New Jersey, very heavily influential on the docks. He was also influential in trucking and waste hauling, which was another area that, probably not a surprise to people that follow this. The mob were heavily involved in that industry in New Jersey for many years. The gentleman on the left, Louis Gatto, he was a capo, longtime captain in the Genovese crime family, and he operated primarily out of Paterson. And as I mentioned before, Paterson and that area around there was also a hotbed of organized crime activity. There's the Decavalcante crime family. That's Sam, the Count Decavalcante. And again, this family was really unique for a couple of reasons. Number one, they were Jersey centric. They were originated out of Elizabeth, and they didn't really expand much out of New Jersey. They had some operations in Florida, but really were very Jersey-based organized crime family. And they were small. They were only about 30 to 40 at their height of made members. A lot of them were related, and a lot of them came from the same part of Sicily. So it was a small family, a very closely connected family, and a very influential family within New Jersey, and especially within some of the specific labor unions that they were involved in. John the Eagle Ritchie was a very powerful boss who took over after Sam Decavalcante. He led the family, and he passed away just a few years ago. But he was heavily involved in the Hod Carriers Union and a couple of the labor unions up in North Jersey. So the DeCavalcantes, their real bread and butter was primarily in the labor unions, and that kind of that leverage they were able to get, both in terms of getting no-show jobs, getting sweetheart contracts, and also their control of who was made head of the union, business agents and such. So that their power with the Decavalcantes really resided mostly in the labor unions in New Jersey. Anthony Russo. So I brought up Anthony Russo. I actually did a talk about him in Las Vegas at the Mob Museum. So Anthony Russo was a very well-known mobster in the Jersey Shore area. He was based out of Long Branch. And in the early 1970s, the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation, one of their very first reports on organized crime, there was a huge section about Anthony Russo, because he single-handedly was able to basically corrupt the entire city administration and police department of Long Branch. And the city of Long Branch basically, for a number of years, became his private fiefdom, where he was kind of safe. He can go to Long Branch and not worry about law enforcement following him, not worry about being harassed. And that became his base of operations out of the Jersey Shore. But like a lot of enterprising mobsters, he was looking elsewhere to also make money. And he's actually one of the few Jersey mob guys that owned a casino in Las Vegas. And this was the Jolly Trolley Casino that was open for a few short years in the mid to late 1970s. It was really kind of a dumpy casino. If you want to know where it is now, if you ever go to Vegas, it's now a gift shop called the Bonanza Gift Shop. The building's still the same, just a different sign outside. And the Jersey mob never had huge tentacles in Vegas outside a few people like Longy, Zwillman, and Jerry Catino, but Anthony Russo was able to actually own a casino on his own, which was pretty unique. But unfortunately for him, he got a little greedy and started taking more than his cut and not kicking money upstairs to the bosses in the crime family. And he was killed at a spa in Long Branch in 1979. Yeah, there you go. He had a big mouth. And violence and organized crime certainly occurred in New Jersey. And as we get in through the 1970s, that violence also brings in a new avenue of income for organized crime, and that is drugs. The mafia, one of the great myths of the mafia is they were never involved in drugs or narcotics, and really nothing could be further from the truth. The mafia were always heavily involved in narcotics. And in the late 1970s, the mob in New Jersey was also tied in with Sicilian mafioso who came to the United States and were opening up restaurants. So this advertisement for the Roma restaurant, I remember this place as a kid. Menlo Park Mall in Edison is right by where I grew up, and I remember going there. And it turns out the owner of this, that's him on a street corner in New York City. He was trafficking heroin through this restaurant. So it's interesting looking back now. I didn't know this stuff at the time, and you grow up in a town, you think it's a small little, Ford's is kind of a small part of Woodbridge Township. It's kind of suburbia central, but there's always stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And over the years, I've come across quite a few references to my hometown in FBI surveillance reports, running bookmaking operations or stuff that, as a kid, certainly I never saw growing up. But it's interesting looking back and being like, oh, okay, that's why that place was open for, 15 years and I never saw a customer in there. And then, the other thing that's really interesting about Jersey and the Mafia is the pop culture aspect of it. This is the opening lyrics to the Bruce Springsteen song Atlantic City. They blew up the Chicken Man in Philly last night. It's a reference to the bombing death of Philadelphia Mafia boss Phil Testa, and it was directly involved in the Philadelphia Mafia's moves into Atlantic City in the early 1980s. And one of New Jersey's favorite sons decided to write a song about it. It's a fantastic song, and just one of these many examples of this kind of public pop culture perception of organized crime in New Jersey. And speaking of favorite sons, I don't think there might be any more famous than Frank Sinatra. And he had been dogged many times throughout his career with allegations of ties to organized crime, and certainly taking a photo with people like on the far left, Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, the gentleman on the second from the right with his eyes closed, that's Carlo Gambino, the longtime boss of the Gambino crime family. Willie Fusco's in here. So, taking photos with mob guys like this probably didn't do a lot to silence people that said, Frank always said that he had nothing to do with organized crime, but these photos like this certainly did not help. And then, probably nothing more known in terms of pop culture with Jersey and the Mafia than The Sopranos, a show that surprisingly now is as popular as ever. I think last year it was one of the top streaming shows still, and it's almost 25 years since it premiered. So as long as this show continues to generate interest, I could start writing books about it, and people will still associate Jersey and the mob and kind of have that inexorable pop culture kind of connection. And but as time has gone by, the Mafia in New Jersey has really declined from its heyday. I'd say through the mid to late 70s, early 80s. And a lot of that has to do with law enforcement activity, law enforcement pressure, as organized crime becomes more susceptible to electronic surveillance, to informants. You're seeing a lot more busts, a lot more takedowns of crime families. Even the restaurants that they used to own, they're being targeted. And the other thing that people also don't talk about is kind of just a natural progression of time. A lot of sons of old mafia guys are not getting into being an organized criminal. They're going into legitimate businesses because not only do you have law enforcement looking over your shoulder, you have a huge number of informants now in the mafia, but also, look at what the mafia's bread and butter was for many years. Things like sports gambling, which now, legal in New Jersey, I know, just made it legal in Florida, albeit through the Seminoles, but still, legal. You don't have to go to the bookie anymore. So, people that are getting charged with things like loan sharking and gambling, now you have, check cashing places that are charging probably twice as much interest as your local loan shark. But a lot of those rackets that they used to depend on are starting to diminish. So as that diminishes, the influence of these crime families diminishes. And this is a photo of the Satin Dolls, even the strip club that they featured in The Sopranos, that was a target of an FBI investigation a few years ago because of its organized crime ties. But that being said, it's surprising that there is still a mafia presence in New Jersey and things like the waterfront here. So the New Jersey Waterfront Commission was recently disbanded, and they're still finding organized crime influence on the piers. Places like, Port Elizabeth, obviously a huge cargo terminal, a lot of jobs in the Longshoremen's Union, and the Mafia still have a presence on the docks. The Mafia still have a presence to some extent in New Jersey. Now, I spent a lot of time in my research talking about like the higher ups, the bosses, and we went over just a few examples of some of the really influential mafia guys. But really the thing about the mob in anywhere, but especially New Jersey, is really the lower level guys, the bookmakers, the gamblers, the associates, the soldiers, the guys, cranking out a living on the street that funneled money up to the bosses. Those are the ones that kind of kept this cycle of organized crime going for so long in New Jersey. And one of the things I think why the mafia as an entity is so still pervasive is because it has this kind of formalized structure. But we don't talk a lot about the associates. Like this gentleman here, he was a longtime bookmaker. He was a bookmaker from just after World War II and through the early 1970s. He was a union iron worker, but he wore these really nice fancy suits. And he was a successful bookmaker for many years until until he was indicted on gaming charges. And I don't think you could probably read his name because it's a little vague, but this is my paternal grandfather, John Deitche. And my grandfather was a bookmaker out of Perth Amboy. He operated out of sometimes a Chinese restaurant there, and also a nightclub in South Amboy across the Meisner Bridge over the Raritan River. And you can't really see it, but he was charged with bookmaking on a couple of days in September of 1971 there. Two of those days were September 14th, 1971 and September 15th, 1971. September 16th. What's interesting is he was not bookmaking on September 15th, 1971. That's probably because that was the day I was born. And I feel very good that he took off running his bookmaking operations for my birthday. The other thing is people ask, how did you get interested in this? I'm a scientist by profession. That's my main career. And I think there's probably a genetic component. But, you grow up around a lot of it. Sometimes it takes hold in ways you don't expect. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be happy to address them. And while we wait for some questions to come in, do you want to talk about maybe your process, the research process that you used for uncovering some of this material?
Sure. So, the process when I first started writing my first book is back in the late 90s to now has changed dramatically in terms of ease of access of information. But how I approach it usually is, I've over the years accumulated a large collection of things like law enforcement reports, FBI documents. That's usually a first start to get some base information. Things, newspapers, magazines, those are good. Not always the most accurate sources, but those are definitely help fill in some of the gaps. The other thing really important, and we talked briefly before about, I'm coming up to New Jersey later this week, are people, contacts. So people that were involved in it at one time, or, whose parents were involved in it or connected to it, having that anecdotal, that primary, that really kind of, eyewitness almost information I think is incredibly important to kind of fleshing out the way I want to write it and what I try to do. And I write I kind of try to bridge the gap between stuff like the hardcore mafia researchers would like to read, but the lay reader can read as well. So it's there's a lot of notes and end notes if you want to get into the minutia, but overall I try to craft a pretty broad narrative and try to make sure that the story kind of flows, chronologically the way it needs to.
How has mafia activity changed in New Jersey with the influx of immigrants from Asia, the former Soviet bloc, etc.?
Yeah, so all those groups that you just mentioned all also have their own organized crime syndicates that are often tied in with some of the different ethnic groups. And the State Commission of Investigation did a report a few years ago kind of outlining the growth of some of these other organized crime syndicates in New Jersey, including gangs too. Gangs are now kind of fall under that same category. And I think that the one thing that's changed is that they don't have that political power that the mafia had at their height. I think that's the one thing, because the mafia were kind of able to skate along for a couple decades. They were able to get a certain level of political power and influence that some of the newer organized crime groups don't have. And certainly why they're very powerful and definitely a threat in terms of their role in criminal activity. I think the FBI and other law enforcement at least are aware that they're out there and they're not playing catch up with a lot of them. So.
Do you ever have concerns about what you're writing?
No. Most of the stuff I write is historic in nature. I try to be very, very cognizant of making sure I have sources and that I'm able to back up anything I write about. The one kind of my joke is I'm more scared of lawyers than gangsters because, but you want to be careful about, what you're writing and people you're writing about. So I try to be as accurate as possible, but I've had a lot of interactions with people, family members of people I've written about, people I've written about, especially down here in Tampa, where a lot of people still live in the area. So yeah, don't really have concerns. I stay away from some subjects. I don't do a lot of modern stuff, so that kind of helps ease the burden of worrying about things.
I really enjoyed your book. It seems like the local government structure in New Jersey makes it easy for mafia operations. Is this also true in other areas you've researched?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point because of the way our local governments in New Jersey are set up opposed to different parts of the country. You have these smaller governments, you have these smaller kind of uh, government entities, makes it easier to corrupt them. I think a good analogous comparison or a good analogy would be Chicago with the alderman system. So if you look at the rise of the Chicago outfit in Chicago, they were able to corrupt aldermen. And similar to the way that New Jersey is set up with so many municipalities and the different smaller governments, I think that makes it easier for organized crime to corrupt. And that's why you see things like, you'll see like a small city in upstate New York that the Buffalo Mafia corrupted, or Cicero outside of Chicago that the Chicago outfit corrupted. So these smaller entities are usually easier to corrupt than a large city government structure.
How many families are still active in New Jersey today? And are any of the families from the 60s and 70s still in the business?
So I think all 7 families I named before still have at least some members still active in Jersey. I don't think there's much from the Bonanno or Colombo families. The Decavalcantes still have some active people, the Philly families. So yeah, I would say some of the families and some of the names of people that are still alive that have been around since the 70s are still active. Definitely far less than there were in terms of sheer numbers. But I haven't seen anything to suggest that any of those families have totally disappeared out of New Jersey.
Do you have any reflections on the lawyers who defended current mob families?
Questions on the lawyers. So I spent a lot of time interviewing Oscar Goodman out in Las Vegas. He's the one-time mayor. And he he actually was involved in the Jolly Trolley case. So he actually represented New Jersey mobsters as well. Yeah, I mean, I think the days of like those kind of mob lawyers have kind of gone away. Guys like him, like Murray Richmond, like Bruce Cutler. And I think you saw in some instances, like Bruce Cutler with John Gotti, for example, where the FBI basically considered him almost as involved as the mafia guys because he was so intimately involved with representing his clients. So yeah, the whole mob lawyer thing is really interesting. There have definitely been a few over the years that have. That's kind of how they became known, and there were a few that actually got in trouble. I think there was one. I think his name was Simone. Out of Philly, who was actually indicted with the Philly mob with John Stanfa during his reign. The lawyer was actually indicted for getting involved in some shady stuff as well.
Um, was Longy Zwillman related to Irving Zwillman, the disbarred New Jersey attorney?
That I don't know. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. Yeah.
What
Yeah, I
activity?
don't know
Yeah.
that about that. So, okay.
What activities are the current families involved with?
So despite sports gambling being legal, there's still illegal gambling going on. There's still loan sharking. There's not, the influence on unions has diminished because the influence of unions in general have diminished. So the labor, the activity also because of watchdog groups and the federal government getting involved. So I think their union stuff is not as big, but the waterfront. So as I mentioned before, I think it's thought that the waterfront is still a hotbed. And then narcotics, drugs. I talked to I interviewed the U.S. State Attorney out of Manhattan for my last book, and um, he said that they're getting involved things like prescription drugs, opiates, things like that. It's not just cocaine and though what people think of it that, but getting involved in prescription pills, things like that.
Someone mentioned that uh, once the waterfront commission was kind of disbanded, that role then was assumed by the state police, and they have a specific unit to undertake that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought I read something around that, but that's good to know. Thank you. Appreciate that information.
All right, let's see. Do you think the mob will ever be back to their height as it was in the 60s and 70s?
No, no, I don't think so. I don't think the way things are currently, the climate's just not conducive for that to happen. And even though a lot of law enforcement attention now is elsewhere on things, especially the domestic terrorism or terrorism, things like that outside, or even an organized crime, looking at like the Mexican cartels, things like that, even though a lot of attention is off the traditional mafia, I don't think I don't think, for two reasons. I don't think there's the ability for them to do that, because of, if law enforcement decides to get back on it, they can crack down pretty quick. And the other thing is, like I mentioned before, a lot of the sons, the grandsons, the nephews, they went into other types of businesses. So I don't want to cast disparagingly about mobsters of today, but you hear complaints from guys I've talked to who said that the people that are involved in the mob now aren't the brightest bulbs, and don't have the leadership potential that they had back in their day. But it could be a generational thing. Who knows?
Would you lead a tour of New Jersey related mafia sites?
I would love to do that. So we were talking earlier. So I do tours again in Tampa, and um, talking around the idea of maybe looking into partnering with other tour companies around the United States and some other cities. But I think Jersey would be good for you'd have to do a bus tour. You can't really walk. You could probably do the Ironbound. The Ironbound, you could probably walk around and see enough spots. But yeah, I think there's a lot of spots, and there's a lot of spots that are still there, which is good. That's always important. It's much better having a building there than staring at an empty lot and talking about what used to be there. So, but yeah, we'll see.
Was Mayor Adonisio controlled by the mob?
Oh yeah, Hugh Adonisio from Newark. Yeah, he had a lot of connections with the mafia in Newark. And that was brought up in a couple congressional hearings, as well as the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation looked into that. So yeah, there were definitely ties between him and organized crime figures. Anything else?
Who would you say was your favorite person, New Jersey mob related to research?
Well, I'll say it's Jerry Katina, because I was interested enough to now do a book just about him. So yeah, Jerry Katina. He was the only New Jersey mafia figure who was ever boss of one of the New York five families. He was the boss of the Genovese in the 60s. He was very powerful, had a lot of connections, both in the underworld and upper world, had a lot of legitimate business interests. He decided he wanted to step away, and he died at 100 years old in 2000 in his house in Punta Gorda, Florida, in his own bed, which is, a rarity for mob guys. So he was a very interesting figure, and I'm looking forward to that book coming out next year.
Right, well, I don't see any more questions, so we can go ahead and is the mob still active in Trenton? Just kidding.
I don't know, like traditional organized crime, the last crew from Trenton, I think by the early 90s with the shifts in Philadelphia after Nicky Scarfo and his guys went away, I think that took out most of those Trenton guys that were tied in with the Philadelphia family.
This is a little general, but who was the last person with ties to the mob? I'm not sure. That's, that could reference a lot of things, but
Yeah, I'm not sure. Definitely a lot. I see a few thank yous. Thank you guys for coming on. Appreciate it.
anything you'd like to close with, Scott, before we finish?
No, just tampamafia.com is kind of a one-stop shop. You can find information about me, all my books, even the Jersey ones. If you're ever down in the Tampa area, you want to do a tour, by all means, look us up. I mentioned I'm on the advisory board of the Mob Museum in Vegas. So if you're ever out in Vegas, please go visit the Mob Museum out there. And look for my book on Jerry Katina, which will be out later next year. And Roman and Littlefield is the publisher, same one that did Garden State Gangland. So.
All right, well, thank you so much, Scott, and thank you everybody for attending today. We really appreciate your continued support of our programming. This program was recorded, so you can look out for a link to the recording and a follow-up email. And again, if you have more questions or if you want a copy of the slides, you can contact Scott. I put his email in the chat, or you can visit tampamafia.com for a whole host of great resources. So I'd just like to end with saying everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.